In today's episode, Norbert asks, what are the most important things when developing a social media communication strategy? The number one thing, by far, when you're developing a social media communication strategy or any social media strategy is understanding who your audience is. If you don't know who your audience is, nothing you do in social media is going to work. Or if it does work, it's pure luck, right? What happens an awful lot of the time in social media is that we create content that we would want to see. We as the marketers create stuff that we would like, right? And if we are not our audience, it's not going to go very well, right? Because we're going to create stuff that's great for us and not great for the people that we're trying to attract. If I sell coffee makers, for example, and I happen to like espresso machines, I'm going to create a ton of social media content and talk to people about espresso machines and stuff. And we may find out that actually the vast majority of our audience would like to talk about drip coffee makers. And for me to be out there saying, espresso this and espresso that would be a turnoff, right? The audience would be like, no. So everything else in social media is secondary to knowing who you're communicating with and what they want from your communications, right? You have got to deeply understand their wants, their needs, their desires, and do so while putting your company and what you want secondary, right? That's another really hard part for marketers to understand is both personal and corporate or brand ego needs to be put aside. Nobody really cares about you until you have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you care about them, right? That you are willing to do business with them, obviously, and willing to trade value for value, but you've got to give value first. You've got to prove, like any relationship, you got to prove value first before asking for value in return. And a lot of marketing fails to do that. So what are some things that you'd want to know to establish who your audience is? Who is the audience? What are the basic things about them? Like the age ranges of your audience, your gender breakdown, ethnicity, generational differences, religion, your basic demographics. Because even knowing something like that is going to tell you about how the audience behaves. Looking at stuff like device usage, if your audience is predominantly accessing your communications on a smartphone, and you are building and designing content for an HDTV, it's not going to go well for you, right? You're going to be creating things that the audience will have a harder time using because you're not in tune with them. So even real basic stuff like that's important. What are your audience's key interests and affinities? Right? When you look in tools like Facebook Audience Insights or Google Analytics, you can get a sense of what an audience's interests and affinities are. What are they in market for? Are they interested in cooking shows or science fiction books? That information lets you create amazing social media content. Larry Kim over at Mobile Monkey calls this sort of the double unicorn strategy, where you find two things about your audience that are unique to the audience and you blend them together. So, for example, if you're selling coffee makers and you also know that your audience is really into, say, Star Trek, if you were to do some research and figure out all the coffee and tea sets that were shown aboard the USS Enterprise on every Star Trek episode ever, you could include that in your content, create communications to your audience, knowing that they're interested in coffee, but also knowing they're interested in Star Trek, and hit the nail on the head so that you create social media content that your audience goes, that was made for me. You made that just for me. I love Star Trek. I love that weird handleless coffee pot that Captain Picard uses on Star Trek The Next Generation. That's knowing your audience's interests and affinities. What's your audience in market for, right? What is their buying cycle like so that you know when to time communications? If you look in a more sophisticated attribution model, it will tell you, for example, which channels fit where in a customer journey. So if your social media channels are all at the beginning of the buyer's journey, when the audience is just getting to know you, having communications in your social media channels that were like, buy now, buy now, buy now, that's just going to irritate people, right? They're going to say like, "Oh, hey, let's go out for coffee before you ask me to marry you," right? That's what you need to know about an audience being in market. what is the buying cycle, right, for your audience versus what is the learning cycle? There's a famous quote from LinkedIn Labs last year, 2021, saying that for B2B, and this was specific to B2B, 95 to 98% of your audience at any given time is not buying, right? So how do you create communications? How do you create content for an audience that is the vast majority is not in their buying cycle, right? That's really challenging. And so that has to be part of your strategy. And you need to know that. You need to know what the buying cycle looks like for you to be able to time your social media communications. For example, if you're a realtor, the sort of generally accepted rule in real estate is that people are ready to buy a house every 7 years or so. So what do you do for the other 6 years and 11 months, right? What kinds of communications? How do you maintain a relationship with your audience so that when that one person suddenly flips into buying mode, you are the first person they think of, hopefully the only person they think of. How do you do that? How do you create that in your social media communications? Spamming people with buy now messages or, let me sell your house messages, probably not going to achieve the effect you want. Where does your audience spend time online, right? Not just what social networks, but in general. This goes back to knowing your audience's affinities and interests. Is your audience a Netflix audience? Are they a Disney Plus audience? Are they a Hulu audience? Are they a Spotify audience or an Apple Music audience? Or are they like the 5 people who like Kanye's thing? Where do they spend their time? What has their share of ear and their share of eyeball? And how do you fit into that, right? How would your communications fit into that? Which social networks are they on? That's going to be partly driven on some of the demographics. Someone who's on Pinterest is going to be a different person, a different audience than the folks who are on TikTok, for example. Not entirely, but there's going to be some places where networks overlap and some places where they don't. So you need to know which social network someone is on. What content does your audience react to most, right? Once you know, for example, that say 70% of your audience all likes the band Journey, right? And you look at the audience analytics, the content analytics around Journey's Instagram account. What content do those fans react most to? And can you gain any insights or lessons from that content? And then what does your audience share? What do they talk about the most, right? Downloading, if you have the ability to gather up, for example, a Twitter list or an Instagram list or a TikTok list of your most avid fans, what are they sharing? What content? Where do they spend their time talking? One of the easiest things to do that almost nobody does is put together a Twitter list of their top customers. And then look at that list and see where those people are sharing their information from, right? It's such a simple thing for a social media ad strategy or an outreach strategy. If 80% of your private Twitter list is all sharing content from, say, The Economist, well, gosh, whose content should you be resharing? The Economist, right? You know it's relevant to your audience. Where should you run ads? On The Economist's website. But if you never do that work to understand your audience and to get a sense of what it is that they are spending the time on and what they think is so important, is so worthwhile that they share publicly, you're missing key intelligence, right? Now, why don't people do this? Well, this kind of research requires a lot of time and effort, right? This is not something you push a button or type into Google and you get an answer real quick. You got to do stuff like surveying, focus groups, one-on-one interviews, all sorts of ways to dig into what your audience wants, right? A lot of back and forth with them, spending time with your audience. If you have a place like a Slack server or a Discord server or some other community, a Facebook group, a LinkedIn group, you got to almost act like an anthropologist. Get in there, start listening, start taking notes, message people here and there to get clarity on certain points of view and things, but study them a lot. Understand the psychology that drives your audience, and you will have much better social media communication strategies once you understand that. Now, given this, you might ask, is it worthwhile to do this? Well, if you don't get this information, then you're going to be guessing. Right? You're going to be guessing And you're going to be permanently repeating your greatest hits because you won't have any idea what actually lands with your audience. If you understand your audience really deeply, you will be able to stay in front of the trends that they will be caring about. You will know what they're interested in, and you will be able to create stuff that anticipates their needs based on your deep understanding of who they are that they might not even know to ask for. Right? If you're making coffee, if you sell coffee makers and you deeply understand how people behave, and you understand that folks who use your product also have a lot of workday stress, right? And they use your product a lot. You might create content about like stress management or project management or time management. And at first it might be one of those things that seems weird. Like, why would a coffee maker brand be creating so much content about stress management? Well, because you understand your audience and you know this is a secondary problem that they have. And if you create that content, your audience sees themselves in it and sees themselves in their communications with you, they will appreciate it. They will be loyal to you because you understand them. They will direct message you, right? You'll get way more engagement on your social media content because you're giving people what they want, what they need. And you know that from the research you've done. So that's a really important question. Knowing your audience to develop a social media communication strategy. All the other stuff, the tools, the time, all this stuff, that's secondary, right? That's process and platform stuff. You've got to know the people first before anything else. So really good question, very important question. Make sure that you know your audience really deeply, because if you don't, your social media strategy and any marketing strategy simply isn't going to work.